We get a lot of interest in the videos that we put up about UAT, user acceptance testing, also known as business acceptance testing, BAT. I got my tie on again for a revisiting of this topic, so you can take my professional advice because I'm wearing a tie.
I don't have a tie, so whatever I say should be taken with a ton of salt.
No tie necessary. You have experience. Experience trumps ties.
That's a catch line.
UAT in the Agile space, is it even needed? Do we even need a UAT? Because I was in a small company, and they didn't do UAT at all. It's a small company, so obviously the rules are a little bit different, so this is a contextual kind of question asked in a non-contextual kind of way.
Yeah, is it needed? Well, I think if you're looking at software deliverables, right, they tend to be complex in nature for the most part. And if you're developing these things over time, or multiple teams are contributing to a solution, and you don't do a UAT, you're not testing things at the integration level, right? And the bigger part of this, because we're talking about UAT, right? You're not involving the users who ultimately will be accepting your system.
Yeah, I think that's the reason I wanted to have this discussion, because in the small company, we would either have people who directly represented the user, which can be dangerous because then you get people get in front of requests, or you just bring the user directly to the sprint review and they get to see the feature, and theoretically, depending on who's driving at the sprint review, they get to, if you let the user drive, they get to play with it right then and there. Now, you're right. They're testing a very small subset of functionality. They're not inside of the entire ecosystem. So maybe it's not a great example, but... Yeah,
but at least you're involving the user,
right,
which is great because it drives engagement. But it would be like if you're building a car and you build the steering system or whatever, and you get the user to give that a quick whirl and say, this is all great. Is the car actually going to behave the way they want it to? At the end of the day, are the wheels balanced? Blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's needed, I think. But going back to what you just said, contextual. I'm just trying to think, how would Boeing do a UAT when they come out with a new aircraft? It isn't a one-shot deal in that kind of example, because you don't know how many systems go into building a plane. So there's integration testing going on throughout. And of course, every level is backward compatible. So you have to do an integration test every time a variable changes.
Yeah, well, I would imagine in the example of Boeing, it's easy to also apply that example to like the car manufacturing, which is the software equivalent is like you wouldn't change the entire system and then deliver it to, obviously if you're creating new software, brand new software for the first time, sure, that would be equivalent. But if you're just changing one thing, if you're just changing the steering, you'll get their car, change the steering, give them their car back and say, hey, drive around the lot, make sure you like it before you drive home in it. That's basically what it is. While you have the team there where you have everyone available, you're saying, hey, come down to my shop or my warehouse or whatever and try it out before we put the hubcaps back on. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the subject of multivariate analysis just crept into my head. I don't know why. So yeah, if you're just changing one thing, but are you changing one thing in isolation, or are you affecting something else by virtue of you having changed that?
Yeah.
So you're changing the wheel or the steering or whatever, but maybe you have impacted something else that's going on, right? Yeah. So fly-by-wire steering, let's say. I don't know. I'm probably not using the right example here. But yeah, it's tricky by changing one variable and kind of saying test this, right? It's very tricky.
I could see that. I could see if the system is small scale, I could see fitting it into your sprint review. But we talked about on a different podcast doing a sprint review that was design thinking. We basically said, can you break your sprint reviews up into smaller segments where you get feedback from the user? This kind of rolls into that for me, where I say, when I say is it needed, what I really mean is like I'm thinking of a much larger organization. Like the company that I was at, that I was talking about, basically brought the user into the sprint review and let them play with it. Usually they didn't let them play with it. Usually it was a product manager or product owner kind of demoing it, and then the user asking to see different things or do different things. So the user was kind of driving, but I don't know. I guess the important part, what I'm trying to get to, I swear I'll get somewhere sometime I'll get somewhere. I guess the important thing that I was trying to highlight was the sprint review seems like the logical place that you have to go out and let the user play with it and bring it back. But if you were in a larger company, that wouldn't work because now you have lots of different integrated pieces that are being changed at the same time. I'll give you this idea and you tell me what you think. In that instance, I think it would be better to have an environment that's always running, that's a mirror of production, that your select group of users have access to, and then you just feed them a constant list of these are the things that are now available to you, and you're giving them basically a running list as your development teams turn in work of these things have changed. Go check out how you like it or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some teams call that a stage environment. Some teams call that a BAT environment.
Yeah.
But it reflects what is running in production,
right,
including data.
Yeah.
The other side of the equation is the users really need to do due diligence. They don't. If you tell them this is what's changed, and if they just test that, that's not enough. So it relies on, I think, your team to provide some level of comfort by saying we've run these automation tests that still stand upright.
Mm-hmm.
Now go test this, because the users aren't going to test everything soup to nuts every single time with every single change. Ideally, they should, but in practice, they just don't have the time.
They're not going. Users are not going to have the time because they have a day job. Yeah, nobody's going to have the time. But if you have a somewhat robust automation and you have some kind of fair test coverage of your critical process, you're basically doing exploratory testing, a bit of exploratory testing whenever you have a new build. So you'll say something around, you have a mobile app that you need to register. You'll say, well, we changed some things in registration and we're doing some validations on the back end, but we want to make sure it doesn't break anybody because they're putting in whatever. We do some basic testing for field validation or whatever, but do some exploratory testing around that, to make sure that you don't, catch anything. It's probably a garbage example.
Well, no, I think it's a good example because, again, your testers aren't going to do exploratory testing no matter how hard they try because they're vested and they think a certain way. Users, on the other hand, they will test anything and everything, right?
Yeah.
They'll go outside the usual avenues and click away at things they shouldn't be, etc. They'll pick up on things that your testers may not pick up on, like accessibility requirements and things like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's not a bad example. I think we're circling back around to that question we started with. Is it needed? I think in most cases it is needed, or you find out by launching it in production and have your real users tell you.
Yeah.
And that's very dangerous.
I think the best test shops utilize the subject matter experts from the business or the users from the business, basically, to try to figure out how to get better at writing those kind of test plans. For a typical tester where you don't have a bunch of automation, they're doing manual testing and they're basically trying to follow the stories and trying to test that the individual stories that are written and accomplished by the development team are meeting all the acceptance criteria, and they can't. Yeah, they're just not in that world. They're not trying to take their head out of the day-to-day to try to think like a user or a customer.
Yeah, they're not doing a whole lot more than just unit testing at that point.
Yeah, and I have to say, a lot of testers that are owned by development, they're under development hierarchies, they're not being asked to do that. And in my experience, not only are they not being asked to do that kind of stuff, it's not welcome. Because if they find something in the pursuit of testing like a user tests, they're going to get told by the developer they work for, who they're going to be told by their development team member that works directly for the same manager that they work for, which likely was a programmer in a different life. They're going to get told, why are you testing that? That's not involved in the story. That's not a bug. You shouldn't be testing that. And they're going to get slapped on the hand for going outside their box. I'm going to cut you off where you're going. I see in your eyes where you're going. That's the reality of a lot of development teams. Yes, that's a ridiculous point of view to be looking at the little tiny changes and rather than considering the system, but that's the reality of test teams.
I absolutely agree. I think in those scenarios, you're going to have the development manager or somebody like that saying, well, it meets the acceptance criteria, so we're good. Right. And that's really not going to serve you well in the long run. You'll just bank those points in your velocity, but guess what?
Yeah.
There's tech debt, or worse yet, a bug coming down your way.
Well, my theory on that one is most development managers, they don't care about the long run. They don't get judged on the long run. They get judged on how many deadlines did you meet this week, next week, They get judged strictly on short term.
Absolutely. I think we're kind of veering into another topic here about metrics. But yeah, absolutely. You're right. Yeah. That's how they're judged. And even worse, in many cases, they're judged on just busyness, taskmasters.
Busyness.
Right? Like
Busyness.
percent utilization of your quote unquote resources.
Yeah. Yeah. Utilization. Well, we're not talking about utilization today.
No.
Or ever, because it's a useless metric. So the questions that I want to ask is it needed? How much is needed? How long is it going to take? I mean, how much effort is it going to be, right? How many resources do I need to dedicate to this? How long are they going to be on this? Because the UAT phase, I'm going to use that term very loosely, so it's not like a line on a Gantt chart. But the UAT itself, that's going to take resources. I've very rarely seen it take more than one resource, one or two, maybe like a lead or somebody who could be a lead or something like that, and they go off with a bunch of users and consolidate their feedback and stuff like that. Or maybe the product owner / product manager deals with it themselves outside of the rest of the process. I've very rarely seen the entire development team consumed with the activities of a UAT,
Yeah, I think you're right. The development team typically does not get consumed by that. Mm-hmm. I've seen good, bad, and ugly here. So the good that I've seen is where there is a team of people from the business.
Yeah.
Then now we're talking BAT, right? So that team comprises of an individual from every role of how the application will be used. So if the application is going to be used by an admin, then you have an admin person be part of your BAT team. Mm-hmm. Because obviously non-admin is not going to know how an admin tests, right, or uses the system. So that's the good that I've seen. The bad that I've seen is one SME picked from the business working with the QA person, who's usually just trying to convince that person, right? Oh yeah, look, you said you wanted this, we've done that. And they're saying, but, right? And so that's the other end of it. Yeah, and obviously somewhere in between is where most UAT efforts lie.
Yeah, you're already going on that road, so might as well drive full speed like that. The QA person getting ambushed to be like, oh yeah, the users have all this feedback, and now suddenly you're not the product guy, so you can't make any decisions. Whoever kind of manages the users in the UAT and kind of gets all their feedback and gathers it together, I kind of think that the person who's responsible for coordinating the UAT, I'll call it coordinating the UAT because again, it's not an agile event in any way, shape, or form. It's not cooked into any of the frameworks really. No. I mean, I guess you could say you could handle it in Kanban. I don't know. We'll go back to this responsibility, accountability thing. The person responsible for the UAT and the person accountable for the UAT are very rarely the same person, although they probably should be. You probably should have the person who's there with the users, gathering the metrics, talking about the bugs, following the plan. You probably should have that person also be able to say, we're going to fix this, we're not going to fix that, or at least be the person that is a representative that does it. So I don't know if that's a QA person or a QA lead or a product owner, product manager.
Well, ultimately, who's responsible for delivering this product to the business?
Yeah. Right.
And so I think that person should be spearheading this effort, really. Mm-hmm. Now, they can delegate some work for sure, but they're the ones making decisions. When a user tests something and says, oh, this is a bug, then this person would say, yeah, it's a bug. It needs to be remediated. Or, no, this is a new desire, a wish, if you want. So then they can prioritize and say, yeah, it's a good one, though. Maybe we should have it. Do you need it for your MVP or whatever, your go-live candidate? They make that decision, and that person is squarely the product owner in this case. Yeah. Now, the product manager can be alongside them because there's, depending on what they find, depending on the issue that's been found, it could also impact the budget for that product, which is the domain of the product manager. So they're working alongside that. The product owner, in my view, would say to the product manager, look at this feature. Do you think this is a good one for us to have? We all think so. Yeah. Do we need to have it for a go-live candidate or not? Based on that conversation, they either put that story in the backlog and deliver it, or they just park it in a post-MVP state. But that decision and that facilitation gets very difficult to do as you delegate that to a user among the UAT group, because the user is going to just have that singular vision of, this is my role, this is what I do, so I can do that well, right? But I don't know what somebody else does, and when they say it's broken, then I'm going to take their word for it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the same thing on both sides. If I think about it, it's like you need the person who actually can accept it from the business to be involved, and you need the person on the development team that can, actually decide to prioritize the work items to bring it back to the team. It change backlog, basically, involved. At the same time, I don't even know how strongly I feel about what I'm about to say. You need those people directly involved in the day-to-day. You don't need those people to delegate to somebody else, and then those people just come back and send reports back to these other people who then have to get the actual testers who did the thing, because now everyone's kind of just pushing responsibility around. They're not, you know what I mean? None of them are actually accountable.
You lose a lot in the communication, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, you lose time
Yeah.
because there's a lot of handoffs here. But yeah, absolutely. I think that should be a team who's doing this together, ideally.
Mm-hmm.
So if a user finds something and the QA person on your team is there, they can see it firsthand, and they can have a dialogue and say to the user, "Oh, we didn't consider that," or "We didn't know about that requirement." Okay, Mr. Product Owner, Miss Product Owner, right? Is this what you want?
Yeah.
And it gets on a backlog of some kind, could be a spreadsheet, anything, as an item with a priority. It might be a wish,
Yeah.
but we don't need it for go live. Or it might be can't go live without this,
Yeah.
because it's newly found information. Yes, we all missed it in the requirements. It happens all the time.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. It's a team effort. And that kind of a finding, or any kind of finding really, shouldn't be immediately decided upon. Meaning if a user says, "Oh yeah, I think this should work this way," and the team shouldn't just pick that up and go, "Yeah, let's just make that happen because this user shouts loudly and we want to satisfy what they say," right? That should not be the case. It should be
Yeah.
triaged.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to ask about was the UAT requires resources from your team, right? Maybe it requires a tester, maybe it requires a developer. It could require a developer. I remember if it's something like API integrations with other systems, it could require a developer. I worked on a mobile app one time where our APIs had to talk to another external API to go get some information, which basically involved other customers. In that instance, you had to align people from the team. So in that instance, it made a lot of sense for the UAT to have deliverables on the roadmap, and the UAT itself to be delivered on the roadmap, because you weren't involving the whole team in that instance. It was just one or two people, but you did need team resources. This is another one where I don't really have a strong opinion. I could see both sides. I could see where you don't need you don't need the whole team. So it's not really a roadmap. You're not really delivering anything. It's just the software being pushed to a certain set of users to give a thumbs up, thumbs down. But on the other hand, you may need your team to be involved. And if the software can't move forward, then that kind of should be on your roadmap. But I don't know. This is a sticky one for me because I don't see a clear distinction.
So this one is interesting because in the traditional way of working, this was always on the roadmap as such. It was on the project plan.
Yeah.
There was a start and a stop date of UAT,
Yeah,
and typically it happened right at the end of dev complete.
Yeah.
UAT begins.
Yeah.
UAT ends. Go live. That's how
Right.
typically it's
Right.
been.
Right.
But in the Agile way of working, we seldom talk about that
No.
when building roadmaps.
Not at all.
And the sad part about that is this. We know it's going to happen to some degree or the other. It's probably going to happen quickly unless it's deliberately built in. So the roadmaps in Agile are consumed by different stakeholders, including leadership. And if they're not aware of a UAT in there, the only thing they're fixated on is that go live date. And then if you go in and say, "Oh, yeah, by the way, before go live, we need to do this due diligence and it's going to involve X number of people," that's not welcome news at that point.
Right.
So should it belong on the roadmap? I believe it should. But it doesn't necessarily need to be granular to the point where you say how many people are going to be involved, etc. I think you need to take a stab in the dark and say, if we've spent 3 months building a product, then should we spend 2 days testing it, or is a week more appropriate? But on the other hand, if we've simply released another version of an existing product, that's a different equation. But it does need to happen, I think. And I don't think there's any silver bullets about how long it should take, etc. So take a stab at it. Put something on your roadmap, at least it's there. It's an easier conversation to have to say, we forecast a week, it's going to take us an extra week.
Yeah.
Then we didn't forecast these 2 weeks that we need to add in before go live. That's a different conversation.
Yeah, I'm thinking of it on a much smaller scale. I'm thinking of how this would look to someone outside an Agile team. Let's use someone in leadership, for example. You just said exactly what someone in leadership would ask. They'd be like, when's it going to be in production? I don't care about anything else. I don't care about staging. Don't tell me about some test environment. Don't tell me about how many bugs or whatever. Just tell me when it's going to be in production.
Right.
And that's it. And that list of when it's going to be in production, all that stuff is rolled into your definition of done, which I think actually is in the Scrum Guide. All this stuff's rolled into your definition of done. So, like, is there a way that this could get rolled into your definition of done? I guess if this could get rolled into your definition of done, it needs to be on your roadmap, basically.
Yeah. So the difficulty with definition of done with regard to UAT or BAT is it's easier to apply the definition of done at a smaller level to the story level or feature level even. But how do you do that at the product level where you may have many features potentially contributed by multiple teams? Then which definition do you use? Then it becomes woolly. The definition of done is it's done and tested and accepted by the business.
Right.
Well, what does that really look like, right, when you come to deliver that? So I think if you put it in there, it's fine, but you're going to end up doing the same thing that you would otherwise, which is to conduct an explicit, separate effort, right? UAT, BAT type of effort.
Yeah, I could push back on that hard to say it should be in my definition of done and I should be connecting to the users. Like design thinking. Yeah, just talked about that earlier. I'll be like a director of product or something, and I'm going to go to my product owners and be like, if you're not checking with the customer about something you're building every 3 days, that's the quickest way to get scrutiny from me. I'm going to come over and look at what you're doing because you're probably down a rabbit hole or whatever. You're not getting feedback. Why are we Agile if you're not going to take the time to get customers' feedback? So my pushback is we don't need any kind of special dedicated phase to do a UAT because you should be doing it every couple days in very small increments, right?
Yep, absolutely. And I think, so first of all, I think that is awesome if it's being done, which I'm not aware of that being the case. But here's the issue with that, right? It's not that it's not useful to do that, but at the end of the day, you're still accepting and working on a sliver of work.
Right.
So yes, last time we met, I accepted this bit of work, that was fine. Today I'm accepting this bit of work, that's fine. And you go along, you merry your way that way until the last bit of work's accepted. But then what's missing? Because the system as a whole is going to be used.
Right.
So that integration is what's missing.
Right.
If you're involving users every couple of days or 3 days, that gets pretty expensive. So you're going to have other set of eyes on you saying, why are these people being distracted from what they do? Because they do have a regular job, right? So if you weigh it all up, I think you'll find in either case, if you calculate out, the cost is going to be much smaller if you have a dedicated BAT UAT at the end. But also I'm advocating not waiting to involve the users until then. Absolutely, right? So maybe periodically get them in and say, get your hands on this, make sure it's okay. I think there's a balance there.
So what would you actually put on the roadmap? Completion of UAT? I mean, I'm hesitant to do that because it sounds like we're doing Gantt charts. You know what I mean? That's my hesitancy.
Yeah, no, I get that because it looks like it's pretty much sequential, right?
Yeah.
But then your roadmap is a sequential map at the end of the day because your go live is way off to the right. Everything happens in between begin and go live. So the UAT fits in somewhere in there. After your dev done for everything, all the features, if you have multiple teams, all the teams, what's between that milestone, if you like, right, to use that old word, and the day you go live? You still don't have the high degree of confidence that the whole thing holds together. And to go back to our car analogy, a team built the engine, a team built the steering system, a team built electronics, or whatever it is. How do you know that that car's going to drive the way it's supposed to? There's no substitute for checking it out at the end prior to releasing it in the wild, so to speak. So I think you're still going to need something. And it might be lightweight if you've been careful about doing it right, but it's still there.
Right, yeah. I'm kind of going to try to marry the two together now. So you're going to check with the user every couple of days and have them actually touching your features, right? Touching your software for the incremental changes that you're doing, for the little separated pieces that you're doing. But then you're going to build in touch points, workshops. Let's call them workshops. I don't know a better way to say it. I'm trying to use the word UAT without using the phrase UAT, without making it sound like a phase in a Gantt chart UAT. But you have dedicated workshops where your intent is just to check the integration with all the features, all the pieces, that they're still working with the entire system, the entire whole. And that's what these phases kind of become.
Yeah, absolutely. And it still looks sequential, right? When you look at it on a two-dimensional space. But I agree. Those were, what did you just call them? The
workshops.
Workshops? Yeah, those were what we used to call progress checkpoints, where the users come in and say, yeah, it's going the right direction, plus we haven't lost any functionality. But getting them to touch the code or touch anything every couple of days might be a bit ambitious.
Yeah, well,
idealistic, mind you.
I'm not talking about large groups. I'm talking about like 1 or 2 people. I'm not talking about a large group. I did this at exactly one client. I did this at. There's one single software development shop in all the time I've been doing this that did it this way, and everybody else just didn't do it this way. They did nothing that I can remember anyway. We had Jira, and we had an extension for our user personas in Jira, and the user personas were like a job role, right? A distinct job role. They weren't general job roles. They were very distinct. I can't say what it is because I'll kind of give it away if I say it. But if you were in a finance industry, it would be like a bank teller. You know what I mean? A bank teller has a very specific job role. A branch manager has a very specific job role in a bank. Someone who walks into a bank as a bank customer, that person is a persona. So basically, in our Jira system, we had a little personas drop down, and we had all the little personas that we had created loaded. And when we built a story, and when we built a feature or story or whatever, and I can't remember, we had every object in Jira, every story in Jira had who that story was for. That also kind of helped us split stories that got big, because we would split them all out. I could probably talk all day about just this, and probably more than I wanted to, because the pushback we got usually was from development saying, oh, this software is going to touch a bunch of users. I don't need 6 different stories for this. You got to roll them all into one. I'm like, I could roll them all into one. But then on the other side, when I'm going to get my customer who's a real bank manager, I only want to give him the 2 stories that we produced this sprint for the bank manager. I don't want him seeing the teller things and the customer things and these other things. Like, I just want him to look at this, because his time, like, we pay for his time,
right?
Potentially, right? That's the example. That again, I'm changing all the names and job titles to protect the innocent or guilty, one or the other. But the reason I bring this up, we were reaching out on these little small incremental features to check with the users that we had a good relationship with, that we could take an hour of their time every couple of weeks to just check if we're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point.
We had a big pool of those type of people. So
that's actually a good luxury to have. You bring up a good point about using personas and roles, though, because if roles are not broken down, to the level where they actually satisfy every user interest, let's put it that way, you run into generalities, right? Like to your point about bank manager and bank teller. So here's another one, right? So a pilot. So you see a user story that says, as a pilot, I want to blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But then you have captains who are pilots, they fly. You have junior pilots, they can fly. So I think there's different responsibilities for those. Some of those are the same. They fly a plane, but then you've got to go down in a level. So rather than just simply using generalized personas, it really helps to get to that role level and say, as a junior pilot, I need to blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
I mean, the reason I brought that up was, if the system that we were using was not organized like that, where everybody had a specific persona, and it was specific to your point, if every story didn't have a specific persona, UAT would have been much harder. Because now all we got to do is we had a spreadsheet or whatever of these personas map to these people, and here's their contact information. So you can send out a blast to those people. Hey, I need someone's time just for whatever. Here's some dates or whatever. You probably could automate this if I was smarter. You know what I mean? I don't know if I would, because then people are getting spam. You know what I mean? It's not like an actual human connection. But we would call a few people on the phone and be like, hey, we have some new features. We want to get 30 minutes of your time to log into your UAT environment, log into your UAT environment and check them out while we're on the phone. We want to watch you walk through them and see what you think. We'll push the update here, whatever, give us some time. And you have to be a bit flexible when you're doing that. It was probably one of the best setups for capturing true customer feedback. But the whole business was behind, we really want these customers to be happy because the business was all about word of mouth advertising.
Yeah, so one of the dangers of doing it slightly differently to what you described, which is we've added this feature, it impacts these kinds of roles or these personas. Yeah. So we target them and say, go check this out. Yeah. The danger in that is, again, it's that unidimensional thinking, right? I've had some pretty good luck. Generally speaking, I'm not a big fan of focus groups. And here, I'll tell you why. Because more often than not, focus groups consist of people that are cherry-picked. Yep. And based on how careful you are in cherry-picking people, you're going to get the behavior you desire out of that and the outcomes. So that's why I'm not a big fan. But where I've had good luck with this is this. Let's say you map all the personas that you can to the depth that you can. Now what you do is you go and find 2 or 3 individuals under each of those user roles, we used to call them actors. Yep. And that's your pool, to your point. Right. So an email blast goes out that says this feature was added, but then the testing happens with one individual, an actor, so to speak, right, from every role. So the benefit of that is this. If the feature only impacts a given role, they're going to test it the way they know how, the way it should work. Where someone else is going to say, well, sometimes we don't get the customer's phone number. Maybe we have to look them up by address or account number. Yeah. That's not a good example, but I think it's illustrative of the issue.
I think it's a great example because I remember in testing, we'd run across that kind of stuff all the time. You'd have required fields, and if somebody just didn't want to give it or whatever, like the teller would put in garbage. And then no one ever knew that they were putting in garbage. They just had a required field they couldn't get around.
X.
So you're getting garbage data you're getting garbage data in the system. I guess that probably supports your system thinking approach to testing, because if you had known that people were going to do that to get around your issue, now when you actually go to try to utilize that data on the back end to build reports or dashboards or figure out how many customers are in this area or whatever, now you got a bunch of garbage addresses that don't resolve. Or you try to do geocoding for some reason to do something with geographical data, now you got a bunch of addresses that don't resolve, that throw errors when you try to automatically send them to your geocoding system, right? That you pay for, by the way. You pay for every single geocode that you go to.
Absolutely, that's correct. Yeah. I have an example to share real quick here. So I was involved in a project that basically used a AVI hookup where somebody calls in and you can see their information on the screen. And that system was being tested in the mode that I just described, which is a focus group rather than just the actor or the user role of the phone operator who answers the phone. Because the phone operator would literally just see the name and immediately say, hello, Brian. Good morning. How are you today? Right? And somebody else who's never in that role said, how do you know it's Brian calling? It's their household. Yeah. It could be his missus. It could be his son or daughter, whatever. How do you know? And that's when the light bulb went on. So you can't assume this. Yeah. So that's another example of why you don't use just people who just do their job day to day to test the stuff, right? Yeah. You've got to get variation in there.
Yeah. And now we just never pick up the phone.
Nah.
That's why they're like, why are you calling me on the phone? Why? Like, I know exactly who it is. The phone tells me who it is, and I still don't care. I don't want to pick up the phone. You want to go back to the day where you had no idea who was calling you on the phone?
Oh, yes. No caller ID calls me every day.
Oh, man.
We've got to get into metrics of UAT and who should be coordinating it. I think we did that already.
We did who was coordinating it. Yeah, we talked, but we very loosely talked about who should be coordinating. We basically said it should be someone with the on both sides, the customer side and the company side, team side. It should be someone with accountability and responsibility on both sides. The thing that I'm trying to be careful about, again, is to try to let people come to conclusions of how to wrap this in their agile methods. You know what I mean? And not have UAT be this weird project management type of phase that's sitting in the middle of their agile air quotes project. right? That would be like if I got out of here and people were like, "Oh, you didn't give me anything pragmatically. You didn't give me anything that I can take back and try to figure out how to arrange this." We probably came up already with a better system, which is do your individual pieces along the way, make some room along the way to bring users in, but then you need a round of integration or a broader round, workshop or focus group, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
I kind of wanted to go into the category of metrics out of your UAT, like what should I be looking for? But metrics, I kind of see metrics as like the result of the UAT phase. Like you need to set expectations before you start with all those users, and then the metrics help you monitor how well you're doing with those expectations. Like normally what I see is you just jump into you do your plan, you jump into your UAT, and then you show metrics at the end. How many bugs are generated? How many test cases were executed? How many failed? How many passed? How many had to go into the rework cycle? Recycle? Yeah. You retested. How many needed to be retested, basically? Those kind of metrics. That's what I've seen. But I don't know. Are those the right metrics? I don't even know.
Those kinds of metrics tend to be justification metrics. We spent 2 weeks doing UAT. It was worth it. Look, we uncovered 18 bugs or whatever.
Right.
But yeah, you're right about setting expectations up front, because what do we want to get out of this UAT, right? Why are we conducting a UAT? What does a good result look like for us?
Yeah.
And people just say, well, it should just work, right? So we start with that. But I will say this before I lose this thought. UAT should not be one of these things where people say, yes, it works, or no, it doesn't work, kind of thing. It should be measurable. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is there is no such thing as a perfect UAT, right? Good product owners and product managers would look at it and say, it does 80, 90% of what we need it to do. Yeah. As long as it doesn't fall over, that's good enough. So when's good enough? What's your good enough point? Set that expectation up front by having the dialogue with them. And if you do that, I think you have a better chance of succeeding rather than dealing with this. Or we still have 15% left. When the reality is it worth chasing that down?
Yeah.
It's going to cost us so much more money.
Right.
Or maybe we do that in version 2.
Yeah. I mean, I would hope that that's where the metric would go, is this round of UAT. There's 2 things that would come out of UAT, right? There would be, I'm just talking just pure metrics that I can think of. How many tests are we running, right? Every story should have a test that goes along with it. I would think like 1-to-1 at a minimum. There'd be 1-to-1. Every story they're pushing out. Maybe there'd be more than 1-to-1 because you have to deal with integration, right? So there'd probably be more, but you basically could take the cost of the team, however many users that you have that are participating in the UAT, and you could take the number of the tests that you're running per story to generate how much does it cost for my UAT per story? You basically assign a cost per story. You could. I don't know if it's even valuable to do that.
Well, you could do that. I think the maths works, right? But the issue then again is you're at the granular level of the story.
Yeah.
Right? So UAT costs X amount, a sliver per story.
Right.
But where do we go from there? Because you're not really going to accept a bunch of stories by themselves. You're going to accept a solution.
Right. Well, again, my mind is going to like a drill down of like your UAT phase cost this much. Took this much time, cost this much. You get that number from aggregating all this stuff up to a higher level. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you should show that number to everybody. That metric should be for the team to understand how to get more efficient. The other thing the team could look at would be which stories have to get retested over and over and over again. Because you might want to look at those stories to see why you had to, we started testing and then we had to stop because something wasn't right, or there was a bug or something that got fixed and then we had to retest it again. You know, but your stories that are going out that are getting tested 2, 3, 4 times, there should be some kind of bar to set to be like, we need to take a deeper look at what's going on. At least your test person, right? Your person doing actual analysis, to say we need to look at what's going on with the testing of these types of issues, look for patterns, that kind of stuff.
Did we miss any tests, right?
Yeah.
So escape defects is kind of the lead-in measure to that, right? And you can measure that and say, this is the number of escape defects we had.
Yeah.
But then all escape defects aren't created equal, obviously. You know, if you've got a field that's the wrong color or placed in the wrong place, yeah, granted it's an escape defect, but it's not as expensive as something else. So I think you're right when you say how many times it goes through the system, so to speak. That is a measure. But the other measure is if that story has a business value, and it should, right? Then I would say if it went through 3 times, I would look at it this way. It should have gone through it 1 time. The other 2 times it went through is your opportunity cost. I could have pushed 2 more stories through.
Yeah,
so
and all kinds of stuff.
Exactly, right. So at a minimum, it's a 1-to-1, meaning you've lost 2 opportunities to deliver 2 extra stories by reworking on this particular story, right? I would tackle it that way because the teams understand that.
Yeah, there's an opportunity cost, missed opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, just got to speak in the microphone. You just said something that was very, very interesting to me. I've seen the leakage number be held against QA. I don't think I've ever seen the leakage number held against both QA and UAT. And if I'm going to say this in a productive manner and not an accusatory manner, then the way I will say it is I've only ever seen the leakage detection number be applied to say, how can we do our QA better? Meaning inside the team's QA. I've never seen it used to say, how can we be doing UAT better?
So when you say leakage, you're actually talking about what goes out into the wild.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. Bugs caught by customers, and then that would be broken down into different severities because sometimes people don't care about little minor stuff caught by a customer. I don't know. Every company I've ever worked for, they want to know all the leakage, and then maybe they only talk about the high priority ones. They don't look at the other ones, but they capture it.
In my way of thinking, once a defect is out in the wild as an escape defect, it really doesn't matter if you say, is it to the QA department, is it up to the devs, is it up to the UAT people? I mean, you're all in it. Hey, you collectively released this thing out there. So again, not a blame culture, but I would look at it holistically and say, we missed it here.
Again,
how do we make it better?
I agree with you. However, the reality of these testers' lives is they work for a developer. This is we're steering back to this dark place that we were trying to get out of earlier. A lot of development shops will measure things that are probably ridiculous to measure. That's probably the root of this problem. When I got rolled under development and I started working for development, I remember they asked me to compile. They want to know how many bugs are written by someone in QA, and then those bugs go to closed with the status of as designed. So basically, bugs that end up not being bugs written by QA, the developer wanted to start reporting that metric up to the director of development or whatever he was. I don't remember what he was at the time. And I was like, no, I'm not giving you that number.
Right. It's not very healthy to measure it that way, I don't think. Ultimately, though, if you want to improve that process, put those testers directly under the product manager, because the product manager's responsibility is to put a high quality product out there.
Yeah. Well, again, in that instance, I don't know what problem I'm trying to explore or what road I'm trying to go down right now, but this has been a recurring problem. Is you have people in development that when they become in charge, there's a lot of finger pointing and unhelpful behavior that they for some reason brought with them. I don't understand why you would even want that number. What are you trying to identify with that number? It seems like you're just trying to accuse.
Exactly. It's blame shifting, right? But to a certain degree, if I can kind of come to their defense, if I must, I think they're under tremendous pressure.
Yeah.
Sometimes, not sometimes, maybe often, extra hard pressures, like you must deliver by here. And the people who put those deadlines in place have never developed a thing in their lives.
Sure, yeah.
But that's not an excuse. I think they need to speak up and say, no. If you want a good product, let us tell you when we can deliver that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What were we actually talking about? We were talking about setting good expectations, and then measuring metrics to either back up or confirm, or what's the opposite of confirm? Not deny. Refute those metrics. Metrics that confirm or raise exception to the expectation. Are there any good metrics? I know I threw out a whole bunch of them just off the top of my head. I was just brainstorming for metrics. Better metrics?
For UAT specifically?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned business value.
Yeah, business value I think is key here, right? Because anytime you have a suboptimal delivery, or something that just doesn't behave right, and it doesn't matter whether it was the problem wasn't understood properly, bad requirement, missed requirement, bad development, missed testing, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right? The point is, it didn't cut the mustard,
Yeah.
right? You can do RCAs and figure out where, and you probably should, so that it doesn't happen again. But the metric on that is really around business value to me. If something was a 10-point business value, arbitrarily chosen here, and there's a defect, meaning I can still use the system, kind of, sort of, as a workaround, well, the value delivered is not 10 because you're forcing the user to use a workaround.
Yeah.
But if I'm just stumped, the value is 0. If you use those metrics, then set the expectation that at the culmination of UAT, we will deliver 80% of the value that was asked for.
I see, yeah,
So
yeah.
all the stories combined, let's say, adds up to 150,
Yeah, I
whatever the
see.
number is.
Yeah.
You deliver 80% of that, that's good enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you can have a dialogue. Maybe there's 1 or 2 things they really need, and we can create those. But if you don't do that, then there's an implicit expectation, which is it should be perfect, and there's no such thing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like the idea of measuring the business value, committing to a percentage, at least a percentage of business value, or setting a bar somewhere, because that kind of separates you from all the rest of the metrics that are just completely arbitrary, or velocity, or just number of stories, or whatever. Or somebody just picks a number out of the air, says, you'll deliver all the stories that this team's done with by whatever date, October 18th. And they just pick a number out of the air because they're being decisive. I didn't see you guys picking a date, so I just picked a date first. How many times does that happen?
Like all the time.
All the time. For
And that's
project
typically
management
tied
right
with
there.
a budget because they know they're going to run out of money based on the run
Right.
rate of this
Right.
team. So they must have something to show for it to senior leadership.
Right.
And then comes the downward pressure, right? Must deliver by this date. I think it'd be an interesting discussion when a date is demanded by leadership. It would be an interesting discussion to have to say, sure, we can deliver by that date, but can you negotiate on the quality perhaps? And let's see where that goes, right?
There should be no negotiating on
Absolutely.
quality.
I think you'll find that's where it will go.
That would be
we want everything.
That would be my product manager remark. There'll be no discussion on quality. Like that is immutable. Immutable?
Immutable, yeah.
I don't even know if that's the right word. In part, anyway, metrics come from your triage process, right? So when you're doing your UAT, you have your testers there. Hopefully, you have someone, like we were talking about, if you have your product owner / product manager who's kind of there directing the day-to-day, kind of observing the day-to-day, right? As long as they're there and accessible, I'm okay letting them off the hook to not be physically there. In my examples, everyone's all in the office. In my examples, maybe they're not the best examples, but I can let the product owner be off the hook to say they're not there every single hour of every single day. But I want them to at least be there, I don't know, a couple hours, an hour or two maybe, just kind of observe how the testing is going. Maybe you have a test person in there. Regardless, whoever is testing, the users that are actually performing the UAT tests, they need a representative from the teams there with them to be able to ask questions, to be able to give them tips of where do I go to do this? This looks a little different, kind of to give them confidence, to give them guidance, that kind of thing. And more importantly, when the users report feedback, right, they open bugs or whatever you want to call them, bugs, issues, whatever tool you use, right, doesn't really matter. When they give feedback, whatever that feedback gets turned into, bug, enhancement request, issue that needs to be investigated by a team, that has to go into some kind of triage process, and that person who does the triage should be somebody from the technical side, because they kind of need to filter it to figure out where it goes.
I couldn't agree more. I think that triage is not dispensable. You have to have it.
Yeah.
And it's no good waiting till the end of the UAT or BAT process. I mean, my recommendation would be to have a daily huddle, right, at the end of the day, and just look at what the findings are and hash those out with the whole team present. I don't mean the dev team. I mean people from BAT, the product owner, somebody from your QA, maybe the QA lead. Doesn't really matter who you pick as long as they represent their interests.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. You talked about somebody opening a bug, etc. Users don't always know the difference between a bug and whatever. So I like to not give them that option up front. Up front, it's whatever you've got, log it, put it in a spreadsheet. We'll call them observations, right? So at the end of the day, let's discuss these observations. And then as you're discussing them, you'll land somewhere. Yes, this is a bug. Then your QA person could then open a bug, or this is an enhancement request and the product owner agrees and prioritizes it or doesn't. That's how we kind of move forward to classify these observations into bugs, enhancement requests, defects, whatever you want to do. But start off with a level ground so that the QA person going in there isn't on the defensive thinking, goodness, they found 21 bugs today, right?
Yeah.
They're all observations until proven otherwise, basically. That's point one. The other point is this. Often what I found is in that huddle, you have someone who says, it does this, it should do this. And that might be an opinion that's not shared by the team at large. It's just one person's opinion. So that happens all the time. That's where the huddle comes in and the PO's there, they kind of weigh in. The other thing that happens is someone says, that's not what we do today. We do this. And someone says, oh, I didn't know that, right? I thought we did this. You find out they're currently not even on the same page on what they do. And this huddle serves as a synchronization vehicle, if you like, for them to get on the same page. Because if they're not going to have the same expectations, then all bets are off.
Yeah, through the course of this, I'm starting to realize like there's a whole domain that again is left out. I mean, I'm starting to realize, meaning it's starting to kind of annoy me that there are all these issues in the domain of product management that we assign to the product owner partially in the Scrum model. Product backlog refinement, and everything that goes into writing good stories, right? So there's a BA skill there. Stakeholder management. Everything goes into communicating and like I would like UAT kind of falls under stakeholder management. All these domains, there's a lot to put on one person, man. Doesn't even have it, and they haven't even engaged the development team yet. You know what I mean?
This is where transparency is really key, I think. So those observations, when they're classified, right, just show that on a chart.
Right.
They throw a pie chart and say, this is how things stand today.
Yeah.
And obviously anything that needs remediating filters back to the dev team.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how this would work at a much larger company where it's harder to get people's times, or maybe they're more siloed or whatever, even though they're agile, like they might have 30 teams. I meet people all the time that are like, oh, I've got 50 teams. I'm like, no, you don't. You do not have 50 teams. If you really have 50 teams in one program, what are you doing with your life? How do you get anything done? You should be breaking that down into smaller segments, man.
Absolutely.
To get anything done.
No, on larger teams or programs, right? This gets to be a challenge.
Yeah. This whole concept, I could easily see you, the product owner, product manager, in that instance, delegating all of what we've been talking about with the UAT, the planning of it, the execution of it, the talking to users, the deciding if something is a bug or a whatever issue or enhancement or not a problem or whatever, all that stuff, delegating it to somebody in some test lead who's over that business segment, right? That's how they like to do it, rather than over teams, and then only checking in with that person once a week. So the best way that I've seen this managed was I was the test lead. The product owner was there in the testing area every single day, and they had reps from the business. They had I think we had a pool of like 10 reps from the business, but they weren't all there at once. It was like 4 people one day, 3 people another day, something like that. They would trade in and out. And as issues would come up, I would try to confirm the issue on my station. And I would also look at it in production to make sure that we weren't catching something that was a production bug. And given that, we would call the product owner over to take a look at it and decide, and right there on the spot. I would write whatever it was right there on the spot. That's how I would handle that.
That's your real-time triage process.
It was. Yeah.
That's awesome, though, that you had a dedicated product owner who could actually make time for all of this. That's not what I've found in the past.
Yeah. Well, she made time for that because she wanted to launch production.
Sure.
And it was absolutely critical to launch production for her ASAP, basically. And so she didn't want anything. Her attitude was the development work, the hard work, getting stuff to development and getting them to pick it up and have a complete understanding enough to work. Because in that environment, I say that she was a product owner. She wasn't really a product owner in that she didn't have a team working on her behalf with a backlog. She basically had to hand it off to a development product owner and then they would prioritize it into their backlog. It was like one development team working on several products. It was one of those types of situations where it should be the opposite, right? She should have had her own development team. Even for her own development team, it was like 2 people to kind of maintain her product. I've been in that. When I was a product owner, I was in that space too. There were several product owners that owned business segments, and then the development team was over here, and we had to kind of share and work together to decide the development team is going to work on for me for 2 sprints, and then they're going to stop working for me for 2 sprints, and then work for you for a sprint, and then back to me for another whatever. Like that was it. I understand. It wasn't. I'm not saying that's a good model.
But it's the old shared services model,
yeah.
right? And context switching. You just remind me of something. So when I was a product owner for a short period of time, I realized that my participation on the UAT would only boil down to weighing in and deciding whether something was really a defect, confirming that after hearing the impact of that, right? Or prioritizing whatever it was, or this story or feature or whatever, is it needed? And in a few cases, I wasn't able to make that decision. I would have to say, let me go back to the product manager.
Yeah.
But the day-to-day engagement, I couldn't offer much because I wasn't really the subject matter expert. I did have on the business 2 people who were. So one of those 2 would always be in that conversation because they'd been working there for years and they understood the process back to front. So for me, that made a lot of sense because these guys already live and breathe the system every day. I don't, right? So you bring people in. So that would be the other thing I would say to people is bring in the right people for your UAT.
Yeah. That's kind of a art all itself right there. Art rather than the science. And you kind of I remember having discussions about this with one customer. They're like, oh, don't involve this customer, involve this other customer because they like us, and this other customer always has bad experiences. I was like, how about you leave this to me? I was like, if we have a customer that has had a lot of bad experiences, I was like, maybe we need to kind of change what we're doing. maybe they're giving us good feedback.
Right? There's room for improvement there.
Yeah.
Right? If people love you already, you're there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, the importance of triage. I've also seen it where development kind of decides what they're going to accept and what isn't, you know what I mean? I'm just trying to show both sides. Like I've seen it where development's just, you have to send everything over to them in the system, of course, and then they will reject it and say, this is not a bug, we're not going to work on this or whatever. That was an environment where there was not a product owner. It was like they were agile, but they didn't have a product owner because they were,
so they weren't agile.
Special agile.
Yeah. Fragile. So, if the business is going straight to development, goodness gracious, right? All that's going to happen is, to your point, development's going to say, works as intended, works as designed, but it doesn't meet the need.
Well, that was in that instance. If they didn't want to fix it, they wouldn't fix it, basically.
Well, they would cherry pick the fixes, right?
Yeah, that's what they would do. They'd cherry pick fixes, yep.
So all human behavior right there.
The other importance of triaging is you can rank things priority order because not everything is important to fix. You know what I mean? Some things might not be right, but you might not care about fixing them.
That's in the 20%.
Yeah, you might not.
Or whatever fraction.
But the other thing is you get some other metrics out of the triage process of what's the percentage of things that we're generating that are high priority, or what are the percentage of things we're dealing with that are real bugs or requirements that weren't implemented correctly. How many things are being retested, and when they come back, they get accepted immediately after retesting. That's probably stuff to measure the efficiency of your development process more than it is the effectiveness of what you're sending out. So I don't know if any of those are useful.
I think they may be if you're looking at trends. Like most of our issues come from the front end or the middleware or whatever it is. Right? They may be useful to see, but that's not the extent of it.
I remember keeping metrics like that. Keeping metrics basically by area of the product. Microsoft calls it area path. Keeping metrics by area path to say, whenever we make change to this area of the code, we have X problems. We have X percentage of problems. And you can break that down by area of the code to see which are your main offenders. I remember a particular area of the code, it was like, this area of the code is 60% of all of our problems. I think it actually might have been higher than that. And everything else was much, much, much smaller. Keeping stats like that. So the cost of making a change in that area of the code is X times more expensive you know.
Right. You typically find that when you have a hybrid environment where there's a piece of code that's legacy,
Yeah.
nobody really understands it anymore.
Yeah.
And that's where some of these issues lie. And then you're looking at trying to fix those. Like, well, can we just live with those in some way, shape,
Yeah.
or form,
Yeah.
right? Post-process some data or whatever. So, yeah, definitely it's useful for identifying the areas in that way.
That's UAT in a nutshell. I think we killed this topic.
I think we have. Well, I'm going to say in closing is you need it. UAT, BAT. We started with, is it needed?
I'm even a bit more clear now that we kind of talked through it of a better way to fold it into Agile. Again, I'm not sure I would call it user acceptance testing. I think I would rename it much like I do with MVP and other terms in Agile that are just been played out. I probably would rename it, maybe workshopping or something. I don't know.
That's fine.
But yeah, it'd be the same thing. Is I want to be checking my incrementals, but then when I do system testing, I want to be sure about the system near the end. I think that's probably my biggest takeaway from here. Kind of looking at it two different ways. All right, well, we're done. Just stop it. Agile Podcast questions at Gmail or comment if you have a time that you did a UAT that went exceptionally well. Like I'm wondering what the circumstances of that were.